Sometimes I go back to that morning in my head, the one that changed everything. And I wonder if I had been a little older, if I could have done something, shouted louder, moved faster, made time behave differently for just a few seconds. It was a Sunday in our small Ohio town, and the smell of pancakes was already filling the house. Dad always made them into funny shapes, hearts and stars, and once he even managed a crooked smiley face that made me laugh until my stomach hurt. I was 6 years old, curled up on the couch with my stuffed bear, listening to my mom humming to herself while she set the table. When he called me, his voice was bright, almost like a song. "Jess, come here and help me with these masterpieces." I remember hopping down, bare feet hitting the cold floor, and running to the kitchen. What I didn't know was that this would be the last time I ever heard him sound like that. 1 second, he was smiling at me with a spatula in his hand, and the next, his face twisted. The spatula clattered to the floor, and he was clutching his chest. There are images that don't fade, no matter how many years you put between yourself and them, and the look in his eyes, that sudden fear, lives with me still. The rest of that day blurred into flashing ambulance lights, cold hospital hallways, and the sound of my mother sobbing into someone's shoulder. And just like that, my father was gone, leaving behind a house that felt too big and too silent for the two of us. Grief has a strange way of moving through a home. At first, it was just the two of us trying to figure out how to breathe in a place that suddenly didn't feel like it belonged to us anymore. I would sit at the table and draw while she stared out of the window, as if waiting for someone to walk back through the door. But it wasn't long before a new face appeared. She met Dan at a support group for widowed parents, and he was nice in that steady, dependable way. He had a quiet smile, and I remember thinking he looked like someone you could lean against without falling. A year after that first meeting, he moved in and married her, and it felt like the house changed again. New smells, new furniture, a different voice echoing through the hallways. I was trying to learn who he was when the next change came, one that altered everything in ways I couldn't yet understand. She told me I was going to be a big sister. I didn't know what that would mean, only that she said it with so much happiness that I thought maybe it would be good for us. When Ethan was born, it was like watching the center of the universe shift. Suddenly, every conversation, every plan, every part of her day revolved around him. I was 8, and trying to hold on to a version of my mom that was still mine, but that version started slipping through my fingers. She quit her job, saying Ethan needed her every second of the day. Sometimes I wanted to ask if I hadn't needed her too, back when I was small, but the words always died in my throat. I learned quickly that I was no longer the priority. Lunchboxes went forgotten. She didn't notice when I sat alone doing homework in the corner. All that mattered was Ethan, and the more I watched, the more I understood that I had lost her. Not all at once, but in little pieces, the way a house falls silent, one room at a time. It didn't happen all at once. At first, it was just small things, the kind you almost don't notice because you think they're temporary. My lunch forgotten on the counter, a missed school event because Ethan had a checkup, a promise that we'd bake cookies together on Saturday that somehow never happened. But those small things kept stacking up, and by the time I was 10, they had turned into something much larger, something that shaped the way the house felt. If Ethan sneezed, the world stopped. If I came home with an A on a test, no one looked up from the game he was playing on Mom's phone. She said she was tired a lot, that looking after a little boy took everything she had, and so I learned not to ask for help with school projects or rides to birthday parties. I'd watch other kids with their parents at events, all laughter and attention, and tell myself not to care. At night, I'd lie in bed, the soft hum of Ethan's white noise machine coming through the wall, and wonder if I had already used up all the space in her heart. Dan tried. I could see it in the way he'd step in when things got tense, the way he'd pull up a chair next to me while I sat at the kitchen table, pencil in hand, trying to figure out long division on my own. He'd help with homework, ask about my day, remind me gently that I was doing a good job. Sometimes I'd catch him watching Mom while she hovered over Ethan, and there would be this crease between his eyebrows like he wanted to say something, but wasn't sure how to make her hear him. When he did try, it usually ended in a fight, hushed voices turning sharp in the next room, while I pretended not to listen. He'd tell her that I needed her too, that she was so focused on Ethan. She was missing me completely. Her reply was always the same. He's just a child. He needs me. And somehow that was the end of it. It wasn't that Dan didn't care. It was that caring wasn't enough to move her. And slowly I started to understand that some things just didn't change, no matter how much you wanted them to. By middle school, I had learned my place. If there were chores to be done, they went to me. Ethan's toys littered the living room. I was told to pick them up. He wanted a snack. I was the one who made it. Somewhere along the line, I stopped asking for things and started keeping my head down. There was a quiet kind of resentment building in me, one that I didn't have words for yet. But I felt it every time I saw her bend over backward for him while I stood on the sidelines. It was like living in a house where there was only enough light for one person, and that person wasn't me. I used to think families were supposed to be a safe place, a space where you could take up room without having to earn it. But in that house, in those years, I realized I was a guest, and one who had overstayed her welcome. High school was the first time I really understood how much one adult's attention can change the course of your life. By then, Dan had quietly taken it upon himself to be the one who showed up for me. He was the one who drove me to every after-school practice, who sat in the stands at my karate tournaments and clapped so hard I could hear him over everyone else. He bought me second-hand gear and told me that he'd never been more proud of anyone when I moved up a belt. It was like he was trying to build a fence around me, a small place where I could feel seen. At home, though, that fence barely mattered. The minute we walked through the door, everything tilted back to Ethan. The house revolved around his moods and his whims, like he was a small planet, pulling all of us into his orbit. Mom never said no to him. If he didn't like the food on his plate, she'd make something else. If he didn't feel like doing chores, she'd say he was tired and I should help. The older he got, the more controlling she became, convinced that the world was out to hurt him, and that she had to shield him from everything. I'll never forget the argument the night Dan suggested signing him up for Little League. I was doing homework at the kitchen table when their voices rose in the next room. Dan was trying to tell her that he needed to learn how to be around other kids, how to lose sometimes and still get back up. Mom's reply was a flat, terrified no. He could get hit with the ball. He could twist an ankle. There was danger everywhere, she said, and she wasn't willing to let him near it. A week later, she signed him up for art classes instead, Even though he had no interest, I'd watch him sit in front of a blank page, barely dragging a brush across the paper. And she'd say the teacher just didn't understand his creative spirit when he quit after 3 lessons. By the time I was 15, Ethan had mastered the art of getting away with anything. His room was a disaster zone, plates with old food, clothes piled on the floor, and she wouldn't even ask him to clean it. I would hear her voice calling from down the hall, "Jess, be a sweetheart and straighten up your brother's things for me." And when I didn't move quickly enough, she'd come herself, not angry, just disappointed in a way that somehow made me feel guilty. Dan pushed back when he found out, but that only ever ended one way. Mom accusing him of loving me more than her son, crying as though it was betrayal. After that, he stopped arguing with her about it, though sometimes when she wasn't looking, he'd give me the small looks that said he saw me, that he wished things could be different. It didn't fix anything, but at least it reminded me that I wasn't invisible to everyone. Graduation day felt like standing on the edge of something I had been dreaming about for years. When I looked out into the crowd, I saw Dan's face, proud and steady, and for a moment it almost drowned out the fact that my mom was there too, but barely paying attention, her eyes glued to her phone. After the ceremony, he called me into his study and showed me a folder full of college brochures, his voice careful and a little hesitant like he'd been rehearsing. He told me he had been saving every dollar he could so that I could choose any school I wanted. Before I could even respond, she came into the room and snapped that the money should be kept for Ethan, that he would need it more. It was one of the only times I ever saw Dan's expression harden in a way that left no room for argument. He said the decision was final, and just like that, for the first time in my life, someone was choosing me. When I left for the University of Kentucky that August, it was like stepping into air after holding my breath for years. Mom didn't come to drop me off. Ethan couldn't handle her being away from him, she said. So it was just Dan helping me move my boxes and make my bed. I hugged him on the sidewalk outside my dorm and tried to tell him how much it meant. But all that came out was a choked thank you. College life was like sunlight after a long winter. For the first time, I wasn't the extra person in someone else's story. I studied hard, made friends, learned how it felt to wake up in a place where no one expected me to take care of their mess. Every week, I would call home, but it was almost always Dan who answered. He told me gently, like he was trying not to make me worry, that things were rough at home. Ethan was starting to spend more and more time with kids who were bad news, skipping school, locked in his room with his games. Dan kept trying to pull him out, to find him some structure, but he said my mom always accused him of being too hard, of not understanding how sensitive Ethan was. As the months turned into years, I found myself going home, less and less. When I did visit, the house looked smaller and more worn, the air thicker somehow. Ethan barely acknowledged me, headphones on, eyes locked to a glowing screen, the sound of gunfire from a game echoing through the hall. Mom would brush past me, telling me not to disturb him, that he was under a lot of stress. The contrast between my life and theirs was starting to feel like 2 different planets. I was building something for myself, 1 class, 1 part-time job at a time, while back home, everything was standing still. And though I missed Dan terribly when I was away, every time I left their driveway to drive back to school, I felt like I could finally breathe again. Every time I came home after that, It felt less and less like home. The living room that once held my drawings and Dad's old guitar was now a shrine to Ethan's things. Game consoles, cords tangled like vines, and empty cans scattered across the coffee table. When I tried to talk to him, it was like talking to a wall. He'd grunt, not look away from his screen, and if I asked about his future, he'd pull his headphones back on like it was an answer. Mom always stepped in before the silence stretched too long, smoothing over his behavior with excuses. He was tired. He was stressed. People didn't understand how special he was. Dan and I would exchange these quiet looks, his carrying a kind of sadness I wasn't ready to face. It was always the same, her fussing over Ethan, me counting the days until I could leave. By the time I graduated from the University of Kentucky, I had already decided I wasn't going back. I wanted something that was just mine. So I worked 2 part-time jobs and saved every penny, telling myself that every skipped meal out, every night I fell asleep exhausted at my desk, was worth it. Eventually, it paid off. I signed the papers for a small 1-bedroom apartment in Nashville. Not much to anyone else, but to me it was freedom with 4 walls. I called home that same night, my voice so full of hope I could barely keep it steady, and invited them all to a little housewarming dinner. I told them I would cook, that it would be special. Dan's voice was warm, proud, full of joy. And then Mom's came on the line with a flat, almost bored apology. They wouldn't be able to make it because Ethan had plans. Plans, I thought, as I listened to the sound of his video game blaring in the background. The night of the dinner, I set the table carefully, put on music, and for the first time in a long while, I felt good. Only Dan came. He brought a bottle of wine and a potted plant, and hugged me in a way that made me forget for a moment that the others weren't there. Over lasagna, he told me the truth. No sugarcoating. Ethan was now 20, still doing nothing, and it was tearing him apart to watch. He'd tried to offer him a job at his construction company, just a start, something to give him a reason to wake up in the morning. But Mom refused. She said it was beneath him, that Ethan was too smart for work like that. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. And Dan, with that same tired but determined look in his eyes, told me that he kept trying. That's who he was. He always kept trying, even when no one wanted him to. That night, as I stood in the doorway watching him drive away, I realized how rare it was to have someone in your corner, and how heavy it felt to know he was standing there alone. I still remember the way the phone felt in my hand that afternoon, slippery and unreal, when they told me Dan had collapsed at work. A heart attack, sudden, massive, and by the time I made it to the hospital, there was nothing left to do but sit in a chair in that bright, cold room and try to breathe through the shock. The funeral was a blur, but there are pieces that will never leave me. Mom in the front row, crying so loudly that every sob felt staged, her voice pitched just high enough for everyone to hear. People whispered about how brave she was, how much she had lost. And all I could think was that the grief she put on like a coat wasn't for Dan. It was for the life she was afraid of losing, now that his paycheck was gone. And then there was Ethan, slouched in the back in wrinkled khakis and a polo shirt, like this was some chore he'd been dragged to, eyes glued to his phone the entire time, his thumbs tapping as the pastor spoke. Watching that, I felt something inside me tighten, a cold, steady knot that no amount of sadness could untangle. In the months that followed, I threw myself into work and stayed away. I thought maybe I could outrun that house, that heaviness. And for a while I managed. Calls home became fewer and fewer, until one night, a year later, her number flashed across my screen. There was something brittle in her voice when she asked me to come, and I almost didn't. But something in me still hoped. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked like a ghost of what it had been. Peeling paint, grass grown wild, everything worn down. Mom opened the door, and I barely recognized her. She'd aged 10 years and 12 months. The living room smelled of dust and neglect. She sat on the edge of the couch, twisting her hands, and told me they were running out of money, that the pension barely covered utilities, and Ethan hadn't found a job. She said it like the universe had conspired against them, not like this was the result of years of letting him drift. I wanted to tell her no. I wanted to tell her about the years I spent watching her pour everything into him, while I stood in the background. But when I looked at her, with those tired, trembling hands, the words died on my tongue. She asked for $1,500 a month, and though the number made my chest tighten, I nodded. I set up the transfers and drove away, already regretting it. But every month after that, the money went out. I told myself it was just to keep her afloat, to keep some semblance of peace. Ethan stayed hidden behind his door, and the only sign of life from him was the flicker of a screen. The more I saw, the more I realized I was no longer part of a family. I was a bank account with a heartbeat, keeping them from drowning while they stayed exactly where they'd always been. The next time I went back, the house felt like a stranger's. There were dishes stacked so high in the sink that I couldn't see the bottom, clothes thrown over the arms of chairs, the stale smell of fast food clinging to every surface. And sitting in the middle of it all on the couch was a woman I had never seen before, long fake nails clicking on her phone, a bottle of soda balanced on the armrest like she lived there. She didn't even look up when I came in, didn't ask who I was. A few seconds later, Ethan appeared, unshaven, wearing a t-shirt with holes in it, and announced, without an ounce of irony, "This is Candy. She's my fiancée. She lives here now." She didn't even glance at me as she dug into the grocery bag I was holding and pulled out a box of cookies meant for Mom. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but the truth was, it wasn't funny at all. It only got worse from there. I tried talking to Mom about it that evening, about how nothing had changed, and how the money I sent every month was going straight into takeout and video games. But she just smiled, that bright, brittle smile, and told me Candy was a good influence. Ethan hadn't been out drinking as much, she said, as if that was a victory. And then she added, almost as an afterthought, that they had already taken care of their future. I didn't understand at first, but Candy made sure I did when I came back into the living room. With a smirk, she told me that Mom had already signed everything over to Ethan, the house and everything in it. "There's a will and all," she said, like it was some kind of prize she had won. For a moment, I just stood there, my groceries still in my arms, feeling the weight of every year I had spent, trying to do right by people who never once chose me. When I confronted Mom, my voice shaking, she didn't even hesitate. She told me flatly that yes, it was true. When I asked why, when I reminded her of every bill I'd paid, every holiday I'd spent cleaning their house, every moment I had been there while Ethan stayed locked in his room, she didn't even flinch. "You don't understand him," she said. "You never have. He's better than you in every way that matters, and I don't want to see you here anymore." For a second, I thought I had misheard, but the look in her eyes told me that I hadn't. Everything I had told myself growing up, that she loved me, just differently, that maybe one day I would earn it, was gone in a single breath. I left without another word, Candy's laughter following me out of the house, like a door slamming shut. That was the day I knew it was finally over, that there was nothing left to save. I drove home from that visit in a fog, hands gripping the steering wheel so hard that my knuckles hurt. When I got back to Nashville, I walked into my apartment without turning on the lights and sat there for hours, staring at the wall while everything replayed in my head. Candy's smirk, Mom's flat voice, the sound of that door closing behind me. The next morning, I opened my banking app and canceled the automatic transfers with one tap. It felt strange, almost unreal, like cutting a cord that had been tied to me for years. For a moment, I hesitated, but then I remembered exactly how it felt to hear her say that she never loved me the way she loved him, and my finger didn't shake. The first month without that money, my phone started lighting up. At first, it was calls from Mom, and when I didn't answer, there were voicemails, long ones, full of guilt and accusations. Then came the texts, paragraphs about how she was barely getting by, about how I was selfish and ungrateful. When that didn't work, Ethan started sending his own. Threats, insults, and promises that I'd regret it. Candy even reached out once, somehow finding me on social media, demanding that I think about what I'm doing to this family. Every message was another reminder that I had made the right decision. One by one, I blocked them all, numbers, accounts, emails, until the only sound in my apartment was silence, and for the first time in a long time, that silence felt good. Weeks turned into months, and with every day that passed, the knot in my chest loosened. I started putting that money away, slowly watching a future I had always dreamed about come into focus. I stopped checking my phone, expecting to see their names. I learned how to fill my weekends with things that made me feel alive. Long walks through the city, late nights with friends, mornings where the only voice I heard was my own. One evening, on my way home from work, I got caught in traffic next to a construction site. Through the open window, I could hear the hum of machines and smell the dust. And for some reason, it made me smile. For a brief second, I thought about taking a picture and sending it to Ethan with a note that said, "Now hiring." But instead, I just let the light turn green and kept driving. That moment was the clearest thing I'd felt in years. Their problems were no longer mine. The weight of that house, that family, those expectations, I had set them down, and I wasn't picking them back up. I rolled down the window a little farther, let the air hit my face, and for the first time, I wasn't running away from something. I was just going forward.